Are we good? All right.
Are we on?
Wait,
Are we on?
Jacob?
Is this mic on?
Yeah. All right.
Okay.
Yeah, Jacob says we're live.
Okay, great.
Check with Jacob.
Go.
Hey, I'm Jeff DeVerter.
I'm King Kingery.
And we're here to talk about some Azure. This is one of the deep dives. Aren't we clever? That was fancy graphics that we just added.
I'm glad we
right
rehearsed that too.
I know, it took a while.
Yeah.
So Jeff and Kent with Rackspace, we've been on some of these before to talk about different aspects of Azure. And today we wanted to get together and dig a little deeper, you might call it a deep dive, into Azure PaaS.
No, that's the Easter egg die, right? PaaS, the Easter egg die?
No. And we will include a link maybe in the show notes.
And we should to our other video, our secret video.
Tongue planted firmly in cheek about PaaS. But what we wanted to talk about today was, Azure's this big thing. It's growing. It is the underdog. If you were to take the two largest cloud providers in the world and think about who's bigger, who's smaller, there's some different angles of the way they're each trying to win in the marketplace. Right. But when you look at all cloud providers, you find that there are, you got some letter acronyms. And so you've got infrastructure as a service, platform as a service, and software as a service. So I guess before we get too far into this, what are those three things? Because if we're going to spend our time talking about one of them, it means we're going to give you some definition, use cases, challenges, and we're going to compare, contrast, or combine from a hybrid perspective how we might use all of that stuff. So,
well, infrastructure as a service is pretty simple, right? I mean, it's taking exactly what you would have in hardware in your data center,
yes,
and it is reducing it down to a software equivalent and putting that out in the cloud. So you have virtual machines, which are the same as your computers in the rack. You have virtual networking, same as your network cabling and your routers and your switches and your load balancers and all of that. And virtual storage, which is essentially just like your drives, your drive arrays, your RAID systems, all that stuff. The advantage is that it doesn't really exist. You can spin up as much as you want, spin it down, destroy it when you're done with it, but you still have to manage it. So if you're used to remote desktoping into a piece of hardware, a computer, you're remote desktoping into a VM to do the same thing.
Gotcha. Yep. Advantages, you get to trade having to go buy hardware for utility-based consumption across networking, compute, and storage.
Well, and the other advantage is that if you're coming from an existing hardware environment, there are tools to basically package up that hardware computer as though it were virtual, making it virtual, and then just kind of send that to the cloud.
Yeah, from an Azure perspective, ASR. Interesting tool for
Azure Site Recovery.
Azure Site Recovery. So that's
not just for site recovery.
Not just for site recovery anymore. That's right. So an excellent way to do that. So when you take those three components, storage, compute, and networking, and you layer some additional software on there, maybe some automation, maybe some baked-in capabilities that's not there natively in a Windows or a Linux operating system, and you start to create a platform of capability, you end up with
platform as a service.
You heard it here first.
Well, and I think the interesting thing about platform as a service is it's starting to get you away from dealing with the bits and the components that do make up traditional infrastructure. So you're not really dealing with a virtualized computer anymore.
Right.
You're dealing with the virtualized capabilities that computer gives you, applications, et cetera, databases, right? That are the thing that are being managed by the infrastructure. You just don't see the infrastructure.
So when you think about things then that you don't have to do with PaaS that I would have had to do with infrastructure, something as rudimentary, basic and necessary as antivirus. If you think about having a VM, you have to do all of the things for that VM, regardless of where it sits in the world, whether it is bare metal, whether it's a VM running on Hyper-V or VMware in your data center or in a managed hosting provider or colo, it doesn't matter. You still have to make sure that viruses can't get onto that box and exploit it in some nasty and forbidden way.
You bet.
But in a PaaS world, that C prompt, that bash prompt, that metaphor necessarily it sort of falls apart.
Did you just say bash prompt?
Yeah.
Okay. All right. Yeah. No. I'm just thinking about how old we are.
Yeah.
So, but the interesting thing also about PaaS is that in addition to the antivirus, et cetera, there's no patching anymore. So all that whole thing of Patch Tuesday, and I've got to go put my updates on it. I've got to make sure that I've got this and that, and all the things associated with managing a machine.
Yes.
The machine doesn't really exist anymore.
The machine, no. Now, is there still a machine?
Of course
Absolutely, there's a machine somewhere, but we don't have to think about it because the only thing that's being exposed to us as the users, consumers, developers, is that resource that they have bundled together stuff to make available.
Yep.
Very cool. All right.
Do you want to top off with SaaS?
We should.
Software as a
I was
service?
trying to get creative and clever on how we
Yeah,
can get there.
I thought you were going to go for a transition. I didn't have that long to wait, so I got somewhere to be at too. So, so software as a service is really sort of the next level up. Now you're not even really dealing with the application pieces. You're not really having to deploy an application. You're not really having to do anything. You're literally just consuming the application as service. So software as a service, whatever it happens to be, right? Email is a great example, right?
Email still takes the right networking in front of it. It still takes compute that's going to run the email application. It still takes a ton of storage because we love to save our emails. So all of those things still exist, but only thing that's being exposed is an SMTP gateway, a POP gateway, IMAP, things along those lines. That's all that's being exposed. But if we step back down into PaaS, it is a framework of things that we as developers can exploit for our application to do its thing. For instance, give us an example of how PaaS might be used.
Well, so PaaS could be used for something like a traditional web application. So let's say that you've got a bare metal computer sitting in your data center and you're running an ASP.NET application under IIS on Windows Server 2012 R2, pretty standard, kind of setup, right? You can actually just take that application, in many cases, largely unchanged, and really just push it right into the PaaS equivalent, which are web apps in Azure, right? No longer having to deal with the servers, et cetera, but you're deploying the application the same way, you're writing it the same way, same capabilities, et cetera. And so you've essentially left behind all of the hard work of dealing with the platform itself. And the platform we're consuming as a service.
Platform we're consuming as a service, which is excellent because it makes that whole platform available to us to do what we need to do. Again, to contrast, as opposed to software as a service, in this case, in the context of email, we just get a few ports that are made available to us to do what we need to do.
Well, and truthfully, if you're really using a real pure SaaS solution for email, you don't even see any of that. You probably just have a browser interface. I think about Gmail or something like that, or Hotmail. You're going straight to the mail application. You don't care about the ports. You don't care about SMTP. You don't know if it's POP or whatever all those other weird acronyms are. I don't understand them myself. I just know how to say them. You don't have any of that, right? So that's the advantage. And I think there's a line. It starts to become a fine line between PaaS and SaaS, depending on who you are and how you're consuming it. So
what's that? So Jacob doesn't really understand then what are we disadvantages of using a platform as a service, because I think that what we're talking about here is all things that are the benefits, the things that work with having a PaaS. When does PaaS not work as well?
Well, there are going to be some PaaS features that are not as powerful as their infrastructure equivalent. And one that comes immediately to mind in every conversation I have with people around it is SQL. Right? So if you're running SQL Server as an application on an IaaS virtual machine.
So just a straight old machine.
Absolutely.
Setup.exe.
Just like you're running it inside your data center, right? And so you can do things like high availability and things of that nature, right?
Custom stuff.
You have some of that capability with the PaaS version of SQL called Azure SQL Databases, but there are a lot of things, a lot of features of SQL Server that are not available in the PaaS equivalent. Now, the nice part about it is probably 90% of the companies out there that use SQL Server as a product or as a enabler probably can get by with using Azure SQL and really not missing the features. But you got that 10% that are out there putting custom CLR code in and they're doing weird things with SQL Server, and they like the job agents or all the other things that don't exist in PaaS. Beauty of it is you can combine the two approaches together. So you can actually replicate data back and forth between the two different types of things.
Are any version limitations across SQL for that?
Not that I'm aware of, but I'm sure there are. Right? There's probably a table we can point people to in the show notes and the links.
Good. So. I'm glad you signed up to go find that. See what I did there? Because I've gotten really good at shunning work off on you.
Oh, you've been doing that for 10 years, so it's nothing new.
It works well for us, at least for me, not so much for you. So disadvantages of PaaS. I also think about, and I've got my enterprise application that's been running in my data center forever. Great, I'm tired of dealing with storage. I'm tired of dealing with VMs and patching stuff. Good, let's just ship it off. Is it that simple?
It can be. I mean, it can be that simple. Is it always that simple? No. I mean, there's always.
Well, I would think there's an element of re-architecture that's going to be required.
Absolutely.
The database that's being consumed, maybe we can't use every feature. Maybe we do have to make some changes to it. And when we're moving out into a PaaS world, we now start to think about some things inside of Azure. We can put some boundaries around it, because what are some of the other benefits of PaaS would be scalability. So it's going to handle some of that
Sure.
stuff. Talk about that a little bit.
So and let's go back to our web app example.
Okay.
Being able to put our web app up and properly designed, let's be sure we caveat that,
Yeah.
properly designed, we can actually go in and literally in the GUI for Azure,
Yeah.
simply run a slider over that says, you know what, I really want 10 of these now.
Okay.
I want 5 of these. You can certainly do
Yeah.
it programmatically as well. Now you can do that in Azure
Right.
with some of the IS features, right? Some VM scalings with scale sets, et cetera, can be
Mhm.
done that way. It's not quite as easy. It's not
you can
quite
make
as efficient.
you can make IaaS start to behave a little
Look
PASY.
like PASY.
PASY.
Yeah, very PASY.
It's a new phrase.
Oh, we should
New word.
PAZZY is like jazzy,
I mean,
jazzy PASY.
could be my new
So,
online name, my
That's
screen name.
PASY.
PASY Jeff. Gang symbol.
Wow. Okay. I hope they can edit that out. Oh wait, we're live.
Jacob says no.
Yeah.
All right. So, so scaling, an interesting to think about, but this brings up a very scary word that you use a lot. And I'm just going to wait for a minute and not tell you, because let's go into your use case. We've got this web app. Dude over in marketing creates the latest and greatest cool thing, accidentally creates it way too cool. And has big visions. He thinks, you know, we're going to get millions of viewers. This thing's going to explode because a famous basketball player might turn to the camera right after they win the NBA championships and say, it's because of this awesome product. And everybody goes to the website and goes.
Sure.
The developer planned for it. All the sliders went straight to the right.
Yep.
What happens?
The cost goes up.
The cost goes way up.
Absolutely.
It goes way up. And
But from a PaaS perspective,
Right.
usually the cost goes up less than it would if it were starting to spin up VMs over time, right?
very
So-
true. So that infrastructure that's acting PASY, you know, if it were to take and spin up a bunch of VMs, the meter's going to move a whole lot
Could.
more.
Yeah, it probably
Right.
will. Not always, but
Yeah.
it probably will.
Okay.
So,
But how do we control? How do you control some of those things from happening? Here's
So,
your scary word.
you can
What
start-
is that scary word?
the scary word is governance. Is that the
Governance,
word you're
it's-
looking for?
it is,
The
it
G
is.
word, yeah.
Try to-
So I think that most companies have at some level inherently an idea of governance, right? And sometimes they control that certainly at the hardware level, they control that because Jeff comes along and says, hey, I really need 10 more servers.
Yeah.
And because Jeff doesn't have access to the data center and doesn't have budget to go buy the 10 servers,
Right.
that's pretty much self-controlling. They just tell Jeff no. And he goes in the corner and
happened
he
before.
sulks. Yeah, it happens a lot, I'm
I
sure.
know.
But with something like infrastructure as service or PaaS in the cloud, depending on who's got access
Mhm.
to it, it becomes more difficult to put those controls around. So
Yeah.
we have things like our role-based access control or RBAC, things
Mhm.
that we can use to be able to enforce the ability for you to only be able to create so many of these instances, only of a certain size, only to be able to consume so many resources, either at the dollar level or the actual compute, processing level, et cetera, but to be able to control what you're able to do.
Right.
And likewise, being able to even do things like scheduling and saying, well, I'm only going to burst that capacity between prime time from 7 to 10. So if I do get some weird spike at 3 in the morning
Right.
because somebody over in China ran out of things to do, or Russia or wherever they are,
Yeah.
or even in Schenectady, New York, and you notice how that just rolled
Roll right
my
off the tongue. Schenectady, a little too quick with
Schenectady.
Schenectady.
I've actually been there. If
I
there's somebody,
used to live not too far from
oh,
there.
is that right?
Fun fact.
That explains
Fun
a
fact.
lot. So,
Yeah.
but if they're doing something at 2 or 3 in the morning and are really causing your system to need to scale up,
Yeah.
the governance is in place to say, hey, at 2 or 3 in the morning, we don't really think
Right.
we need to auto scale, so we're not going to auto scale.
Right.
Now that might mean a performance issue for the 1 or 2 legitimate users that are on there, but at least you're not seeing
Right.
your costs go through the window.
Which
So,
is good, so you can put those sort of boundaries in place. So even though Jeff has access to deploy his app and put some elastic capabilities into it, I'll just give you you can be the
Right,
boss of me today,
right.
can put controls in place that help make sure that gets managed
Yeah.
appropriately over time.
I think one thing to remember too, as we think about Azure specifically, is if you look across what Microsoft has done from a feature perspective, right? They have made it very, very easy. I won't say it's like completely easy,
Yeah.
but very, very easy for a developer or a group of people to take an application and move it from hardware in a premise to IaaS VMs in Azure, from IaaS VMs in Azure to platform as a service. It made it very, very simple. So here's a great one for anybody who's ever developed an ASP.NET application knows about the web config file.
Yeah.
That web config file, the ability to control the configuration parameters, actually exists in the Azure portal for a PaaS web app, right? So where you used to have to RDP into the box and you had to go and you had to set the web config, number of users or whatever the feature happened to be in your app settings section of web config. That stuff actually gets surfaced in the Azure portal, and you can literally have a user be able to go in and change the web config without ever touching the application at all, right? Without having an RDP into a box, do any of that. So that familiarity of, I've got an app setting goes through all the way from the hardware side all the way to PaaS.
Well, and you created this stair-step expectation where somebody can go from on-prem, they can go into IaaS, they can get up into PaaS. Are they discrete steps? Do solutions need to be in one of those discrete containers, or as we start to think about evolving our application to be more PaaS-y, is it an all or nothing move?
No, it's actually not. I have a customer that I work with who actually has part of their application sitting in IaaS VMs. Okay. They have part of their application sitting on a premise system in hardware. They are connected via a VPN back from Azure into their data center. And part of the application sitting in web apps in the PaaS feature inside Azure. The web app talks to not only the IaaS VMs, but it also talks to the on-premise hardware as well, right? Through URLs and through routing, et cetera, but it all appears as one solution. And let me tell you why they did it. They did it because in the hardware side, in the premise side, they actually have some hardware requirements, some security token type things that have to be attached to the hardware, which cannot be replicated inside the cloud, right? But where the VMs are concerned in the cloud, they actually have something that needs to run as though it were a full machine because of the way it's been coded. And the return on changing that is not nearly enough to
not as much as the machine costs.
Absolutely. And so they spin that up. And then for the new development, they're pushing almost everything UI, content related, that is all going to the PaaS side.
So we're supposed to be on this deep dive. We're going to tell you about all these great features inside of Azure and PaaS. And what I feel like we spend most of the time doing, Kent, whether it's you and I on camera somewhere or whether we're in front of a customer, is explaining why cloud actually makes things in a lot of cases a lot more complex.
It's 2016, right? You would think that
you
by
would think
now,
that we're making things easier, but we don't because one, it tends to not be, I'm gonna say it's not, it can be. It tends to not be a single step forward. In other words, we're lifting our backpack up and we're stepping forward and we're gonna put our backpack down and we're gonna live there for a while. No, what it means is we're not picking up out of the data center and moving into one thing. It means that this is just becoming a more complex enterprise application that still requires a whole lot of management and attention.
Absolutely. And so if we just focus on PaaS just for the time being, part of the challenge with PaaS is being able to look at the feature and functionality that you have in your application solutions and your workloads, et cetera, and understanding how to map what you're used to in a discrete compute environment where you've got servers and you've got databases and all that, how to map that onto the Azure features, especially where Azure is concerned. So if you look at some of the PaaS features like, Service Bus is not a great example because Service Bus exists in other forms. Service Bus even exists in Microsoft Private Cloud, right? So in the Hyper-V world and so forth. But if you take a look at something like IoT Hub is a great example. IoT Hub, really a PaaS feature. There is no spinning up a VM and like turning it on and going to an IoT process. It is a PaaS feature. And so now you're thinking to yourself, well, how would I use that? What does that map to over here? Oh, wait, I've got all these web services and these apps over here that their whole point is just to ingest data from various and sundry things, devices, whatever it happens to be. Maybe that is a choice for IoT Hub. Right. And then it's that mapping process. That's the road mapping, the journey. That's I would argue there's more thought required. You got to plan. Right, you got to plan, especially if you're planning to have something in each one of those worlds, right? Something in premise, something in IaaS, something in PaaS.
Yeah, and a lot of my world is just helping people think that the cloud, you just can't lift it up and shovel it off into the cloud and it all works better. It takes planning and thought, just like any real application would take. There's no easy button here.
There's really not, but
there's a change button.
But think about this. You have an existing, I keep going back to my ASP.NET application because I've spent years and years and years and years building them. You think about that ASP.NET application, and all of a sudden you have the ability to deploy it into an Azure region or an Azure data center, right? So South Central, right? Sitting here, right here, down near SeaWorld, right? You can go down on your way to see Shamu. You can go see, on the right, absolutely. And so what you get to do is you get to deploy into there, but all of a sudden somebody comes and says, wow, I really need that application to be able to service users in the Hong Kong region, right? And because of performance, because of whatever, that application deployable right into Hong Kong.
Right click go.
Absolutely.
Basically.
Yeah, absolutely. You just
so there are
pick the region
huge
to go to.
benefits to being a PaaS-centric application. Being portable cross-region is a massive one.
You bet.
Let's talk about data resiliency.
Okay.
So think about that scenario where, okay, now we need this application running in Hong Kong as well, separate, distinct customer set, but now we need to get that data merged together because the marketing guys at some point need to look at this from a BI perspective and look at return. So we need to put some tooling in place. Is Azure SQL going to be a good place to blend that together?
I think certainly Azure SQL can do and satisfy that need.
Yeah.
I mean, again, it's going to go back to, are there features of SQL Server running in a VM that you really want for that resiliency, that high availability, et cetera, that sort of thing. But absolutely, you can replicate data and do whatever you need to. It treats it the same way. And so a lot of what I see is that sort of data being moved around to point of need. So, right. So if you've got a bunch of, let's say you're a multinational company and you've got vendors in Canada and you've got vendors in Hong Kong and you've got vendors in the US, and probably those vendors for the most part don't do business outside their country, right? They're kind of in Canada or they're in the US.
Where the customers.
Right? So the ability for you to push or move or replicate that data, only what matters to that location then to those places, so that your performance against that data is very, very good. And then consolidation, reporting, aggregation, that sort of thing, that can happen in some other fashion where performance isn't as much of a challenge, right? The whole difference between transactional, right, OLTP type systems and regular just data warehousing.
So that's interesting. In IaaS or a PaaS scenario is not anything that's unique to Microsoft.
It's not.
No. And so I was arguing with Jacob yesterday about this.
He likes to argue a lot. Have you ever noticed that?
He's always poking.
Very quiet, sits behind the camera and argues all the time.
And then he says, those other.
Hang on. He says, no, he does not argue. I rest my case.
That guy. So he tells me that hey, there's this cloud war going on between those two primary providers.
Those two big behemoth providers.
Those big ones.
Yeah.
They're big. Yeah. And he says, what's really the difference at the end of the day? You got your PaaS over here, you got your PaaS over there. I think Microsoft may be up to something here to help from a differentiation perspective when we start thinking about not just PaaS, but PaaS extensions, site extensions.
Yeah.
What do you think about site extensions?
Well, so I think the ability to be able to put an extension in place and add features to a thing that really, it almost defies description, right? You've got a web application out there, you got a website out there, and all of a sudden now you can put monitoring on it. You can put testing capabilities. You can do all sorts of things to it through these extensions.
Yes.
So it's almost like, although not quite, but almost like buying a car and then being able to get aftermarket, spoilers and fog lights and, the little Nerf bars that run down the side of your SUV so you look really cool. I used to have a set of those. Didn't make me look cool at all. But those sorts of things, the extensions, the bolt-ons, being able to do that is pretty powerful stuff.
Right.
And being able to do that from a simple GUI where you go on and go, you know what, I really want monitoring.
Because when you think about PaaS, what you lack is that ability to get the console of the machine that's running the PaaS feature.
Right.
And not having access to that console means I don't have the ability to go then and run the setup.exe for that monitoring application that I love so dearly, or that PHP site extension thing that I need. I can't run anymore. But when you have the makers of these applications, of these add-on services, be consistent and be compatible with Azure PaaS, then you have the ability from a site extension perspective to right-click add.
You bet. And not only that, you have the ability to create your own extensions. So if you're a company that is doing that sort of work and has some sort of an extension that makes sense, right? It's very, very simple for you to be able to create that extension, put it out in the gallery, put it out in some area, and then be able to apply that across your other sites, right? It's really cool. And then maybe even put it in the marketplace and make some money off of it, right? I mean, nothing wrong with that at all. Nothing wrong with making a little money, right? So,
and I think that's a pretty huge differentiator between the two clouds.
I think it is too. I think that's well, I think that's actually could be a gigantic differentiator depending on your need. But don't also forget that part of the differentiator for Microsoft and Azure is that if you are a Microsoft development shop and you spend a lot of your time in, and here we go, wait for it, ASP.NET development.
Thank you.
Right, we're back to it again.
20
if you
years,
spend a lot of
folks.
time doing that, then Microsoft is an extraordinarily friendly environment from a PaaS perspective.
Yeah.
You really right now can't just pick up your ASP.NET app and just jam it into AWS, right, or Google, or IBM's SoftLayer, whatever it is. You can't really do that easily. Microsoft, you absolutely can. And in fact, so easy, you can go to Visual Studio, change the place where you're deploying, hit a button, and there it goes.
And off it goes.
Yeah, off it goes.
It's almost like they're trying to make money at this thing.
It's almost like they're starting to care about the people that develop applications on their platform.
So we're going to call you Mr. Segway. Yes, absolutely. You've been paying attention.
Do I get a segue?
No, but we can take you from one place to another very
Segway
easily.
is still a thing?
I think so.
Okay.
I think so. Well, that's Jacob. We'll talk about that later. You pay attention to DockerCon at all this week?
I did.
Did you?
I did.
Microsoft had some announcements there.
They did.
So when we think about Microsoft really trying to get out of the way of themselves to make their cloud accessible to any developer, some of those announcements this week, I think, personify that, where you're able to then take that Docker enterprise, container application. Now that's an ARM template.
Sure. Well, I think that Microsoft's foray into containers is an interesting one to watch.
Yeah.
They didn't create that technology.
Nope.
They didn't. They've certainly had virtualization for a long time, right? I mean, we all remember Virtual PC and the move to Hyper-V and et cetera, et cetera. But the whole container world is a lot different. We could do a whole, another thing, which we probably will, on containerization and why it's important. But for Microsoft to finally say, hey, not only are we putting this into Windows Server, not only are we making this a thing, Hyper-V containers, et cetera, now what we're doing is we're putting it into Azure as Azure Container Services, and we're giving you the ability to containerize. So just this week, even prior to some of these announcements, I'm actually working with one of our engineers who is building a containerized VPN solution that can be deployed into a customer's environment to give more VPN capabilities than the existing point-to-site. And it's powerful stuff. You see it work. It's so simple. It's not a VM. It's just a container literally deployed from a container library somewhere.
That guy's smart. We should invite him in.
We should.
We need some brains in here, apparently.
He's like 4,000 miles away is the problem.
Yeah.
So, but we could
make it hard.
We could
it's the Googles.
Absolutely.
Google's Hangouts works
Absolutely.
Well. But one other thing I thought was really interesting about the announcements this week around Docker and containers is that it puts that Docker management layer in front of Azure.
Yes.
Which is huge.
Yes.
Because you don't now go to Azure to manage your thing. You go to the container manager to manage your containers.
Correct.
And your services across containers.
And the same tools that you would use inside that container management,
but
not in Azure.
That's right.
Simply just all you've done is abstract Azure away.
So now you've got this infrastructure layer of capability that is 100% abstracted from the folks writing applications running inside of those containers. And that's huge, because if you think about what Microsoft has done over the past several years, is it feel like they're just trying to get the heck out of their way and make some great services.
Well, I think at the end of the day, a lot of the people that work for Microsoft are developers. They're technologists, right? They use this stuff. They're not just, creating it and throwing it out there to see if it'll stick. They're actually building a lot of this stuff for their own needs. And so the containerization piece, I think, is a natural evolution, right, as you watch it. Hang on just a second. Yeah, Jacob wants me to make sure that we tell people that if they have questions to ask, then there is a Q&A function inside the Google Hangout. So you guys can go over, I think it's on the toolbar on the left, and you can pick Q&A and you can type your question in. So if you have a question, feel free to type it. We'll do our best to answer it. If we can't answer it, then we'll probably just ignore
make something
it.
up.
We'll ignore it. Oh, well, that's right. We could do that too. We could pull random answers out. Not even be to the question they ask. So
4 cups in a... Never mind.
I think it's a pints a pound the world around. I think that's what you were headed for. So.
Yeah, that's it. All right. So Microsoft getting out of the way, containers, and PaaS. So that leads me to a thought. I know we're here to talk about PaaS. We're talking about PaaS from an Azure perspective, and there's only so much we can talk about in this context, but let's talk about Azure Stack a little bit, because Azure Stack, very published, this is known information, not under NDA. This is Azure. It is the framework of Azure. It is the code base of Azure. It is scaled back, of course, because you're not running every capability that would exist inside of Azure. And PaaS is absolutely a piece of that Azure Stack story.
You bet. Well, and it's got a heritage, right? I mean, if you take a look at today's existing private cloud platform, which we do a lot of here at Rackspace, you can take a look and see that there are websites which are very, very equivalent to the websites that were in the old Azure V1 and are equivalent to web apps today. There is the service bus capability that's in there, and there is database as a service. So the ability to have SQL Server tables and databases and so forth surfaced without having to deal with the actual SQL Server itself. So that heritage is already there.
That's right.
But now you take a look at Azure Stack and you look at the evolution of where it's headed. It really is an attempt to bring parity across the public cloud and private cloud.
I think it's going to be really interesting to see if sites and those capabilities are native to it, and we can write an application that we think is got to run in an Azure Stack, but be able to expand and burst out into public PaaS.
Right, just like you do today with virtualized systems, because we can do that today. Azure Site Recovery, great example. You can take a VM and you can have it on your premise. You can have it in a Rackspace data center. You can have it in your data center. You can burst it over then to Azure, right? And so right now that is an IaaS-y sort of bursting capability, but eventually you'll be able to do the same thing at the PaaS level.
That's right.
Yeah, and a lot of times it's not even so much about the bursting. I mean, we talk about that. We talk about disaster recovery, and that's a great use case. Everybody talks about it. But it's about putting the workloads and the pieces of the workloads in the places that make the most sense.
That's right.
So let's say, for example, here's an Azure PaaS feature, Azure Functions, right? Being able to have little bits of code that sit out in Azure, right, and are able to respond to a time of day or to an event or to some kind of a get or a post over a URL.
Sure.
You've got that capability, right? Wouldn't it be great if that thing that you need to do, that you think you need to do on your premise, really could live in Azure Functions? It'd be easier to maintain, easier to write, easier to deploy, et cetera. You push that out there and you keep the rest of the app somewhere else. And slowly over time, you start to begin to do it just like you would an 11-person football team. You're going to go play center. You're going to go play right guard. You're going to go play running back. Kent, you're going to go play bench warmer, right? That kind of thing.
Sitting next to me.
Not that I'm bitter.
So let's get very specific about an application, because I think if we go down the road of a real life scenario, we can really talk about where PaaS is great. We can talk about even where SaaS has a place and where IaaS really maybe should play. All right, so you and I have just started a business. Congratulations.
Yeah, thank you very much.
We've worked together, but we've never been in business together.
Got an office
this
with
is
with like windows and stuff.
Yes, just outside by the dumpster. Good. This is a business that sells high style wingtip shoes. High style
wingtip shoes. Yes, David Grant, we're talking about you.
High style wingtip shoes. It's actually a reference from the show MASH. If you've ever, it's what Radar went and sold. And so as we have a manufacturing plant.
Old.
I know we have a manufacturing plant. It's actually, we have a couple of them. We have some in the east. We have some here in the west. We have a.
Now, when you say east, are you talking about New Jersey? Or
I'm talking about Hong Kong.
China. Okay,
I'm talking about China.
All right, got it.
We're going where it makes economic sense for some of these to be made. But it also we're also warehousing close to where we manufacture, so that we can cut down on some shipping costs. Now we've got our data centers we're in San Antonio. Our data center is here in San Antonio. It's where we have our core processing. It's where our financial systems exist. But we have the world's most awesome website, www.hightstylewingtipshoes.davidgrant.com, and on there it is a full featured website. And this website is gorgeous. We have paid, you know how much we paid for models to model these things.
Absolutely.
And some of the
models, you think hand models are
some of the locations we
went,
pretty amazing.
Yeah.
So this is a full featured catalog website.
Got it.
This catalog website needs to be available. I mean, and the demand is amazing.
Absolutely.
Australia, South America, America. I mean, the Norskis, they love these things.
You bet.
But their demands for speed on this catalog site is pretty huge.
Sure.
So from a developer perspective, we need a website that is just, it's hopping.
Yep.
because it's somebody coming into this site and then being able to find the shoe that is the right shoe for them. And then ultimately, once they've made it through all of that, we got some really cool VR capabilities in there, but ultimately they need to place a transactional order and so we can have it delivered to them. So let's design this website. Let's design this whole infrastructure.
Yeah. So I think first and foremost, I always like to start at the data, right? Where are we going to put the data? Where are we going to put orders? Where are we going to put whatever, right? And I think that the first thing we might do is we might build ourselves data capabilities in the locations where it makes sense for transactional processing. So when you go to ready to do an order and you need to get an order number back and you need to look up a price or whatever, you don't want to constantly having to come over the 56K modem, right, from Hong Kong all the way back to Schenectady, right, to get your data, right? You want to be able to have that information, especially things like lookup tables, tax rates, and that sort of thing. You want to be able to have that in region. In the region, right? And especially where it is region specific. So why in the world would I keep all the tax tables for Hong Kong sitting in my database for the US if I don't really need them, right? Especially if I'm not accessing them transactionally. So that's the first thing.
So we're going to have a data center for data. We'll have a location for data in the East, Far East. We'll have one in Europe, maybe Central Europe, but somewhere in that area, Americas and South America.
Right. And we might have an additional data capability wherever our headquarters is, which is, of course, beautiful San Antonio, Texas.
That's right.
Come visit us anytime. Come all you want. We'll make more. We would have that capability here to consolidate data for reporting. So for warehousing, we're doing, like financial reporting, we're doing analytics.
So region-specific information in region, centralized data warehouse.
You bet.
Just use an older term. Is going to be in San
absolutely
Antonio.
Right.
Great.
So we've got that. So let's go to the next level up. We probably have some sort of catalog of services that we are going to call, getting a search, for show me all the blue wingtips, or show me all the wingtips in a size 12 medium, or show me all the wingtips that have the ability to have colored laces, right? All those kinds of things. Show me the lace up ones versus my favorite, the double monk strap.
You do love the double monk strap. I didn't know what one of those was until this week.
Yeah, well, it's twice the single monk strap, right? So if one is good, two is definitely better. So, but if you look at that, then those services then are going to be consumed again, probably close to the region. Now, but here's the difference. As long as the data is in region, it's quite possible that you could consolidate your service calls into a smaller number, right? Because you're really just passing the call off to the data's operating and passing it back. But the point is that you could have that in region all around, right? So in the event that you have a problem in one region, it doesn't cause a problem in another region. Something happens in the US, it doesn't affect Europe. Something happens in Europe, it doesn't affect Hong Kong, all right?
All right.
So this whole idea of localizing things.
Localizing is important.
Yep.
Refresher, we've got a data warehouse in San Antonio. We have region-specific data spread into about 4 different locations. And in probably those same locations is a bundle of services.
Yep.
Those services are managed by our developers here in San Antonio and published.
You got it.
Okay.
Right.
Next step.
So the next step up is obviously, whatever the UI is, the user interaction, user interface pieces, right? That we're going to show the catalog. We're going to allow you to place an order. We're going to allow you to search. We're going to allow you to look at
functional
more
activities.
Detail. Absolutely.
Okay.
And these are all things that are important to a user for it to be snappy, because based on the research that I've read, and I'm sure you've read over time, if it takes longer than a certain number of seconds for a website to respond, you're generally on to the next thing. And I can tell you personally, if Amazon takes a while to get something done, I'm going to be really, really looking for another place to get my stuff from. Right. So it's important for those things to be, again, in region, close to the use.
It sounds like service-oriented architecture.
I knew you were going to bring that up. See, this is the problem. You always look for the things that get my goat.
I know.
Right?
You're having too much fun with this. It was time to just kind of razz you a little.
Yeah. It sounds like
that bundle
ability,
of code. So that bundle of code is now taken on a couple of forms, but it's still a bundle of code.
Well, and not only is it a bundle of code, but it's also a bundle of resources. So, for example, catalog images is always a big one, right?
Images.
So maybe we're dealing with catalog.
Now we're to
images,
assets,
and we're actually creating those. We're doing all of our model shoots, and we're doing our pictures and everything in our beautiful photo studio here in San Antonio. We get all that done. We're pushing that data out to where it needs to go, especially things like the VR or movies or that sort of thing, content, right, that gets moved around.
So question about that, do we go just to those same areas where we have our data, or since now we're talking about file repositories, maybe we go a little more granular with that.
Maybe we use the content delivery network inside of Azure to push that stuff around,
That's
right? Because we may find that even though we have this in Hong Kong, it could be that in Singapore or in Vietnam or in some other place they're really doing it. And now all of a sudden what we really
get
need
into a really low bandwidth area.
You bet. And if we're dealing with a place where those resources are really the clog up point,
well, what if
even
we're
if it's
serving,
high bandwidth.
what if we're serving in India where the predominant view or browser is a small device?
So I would argue that that's getting largely the same way as it is here, right?
True,
I mean,
but there's a bandwidth challenge.
You walk around it. It's always, absolutely.
Yeah.
So I think that what you end up with is you end up saying, hey, even though it's a bandwidth challenge, the bandwidth challenge is probably more grabbing that from outside the region. Right? So I'm in Bangalore and I'm trying to get to it in the data center in Hong Kong, right? Instead, push your pictures, push your content, your big things. Content delivery network everywhere it is, right?
That's right?
And I don't have to move the website itself necessarily because it's HTML code, right? For the most part, pretty quick to move it around.
It can be a single file.
I mean, I can remember the days as you can when the web was really fast and snappy because we only had like 2 colors and we only had like 4 font sizes.
And we
Kids, this is what television was like before there was color.
And we looked at it on Netscape.
Yeah, and we liked it that way.
We liked it. You got one thing.
That's right.
All right, so we built this really interesting application, and this is a very different mindset of what we would have thought. You and I have known each other for 10 years. If we had this conversation 10 years ago, we're talking about physical servers and physical data centers that probably exist in one place in the world.
Absolutely.
And it's the only solution we really had. But now what we've talked about is a collection of resources. Right. That data warehouse running in San Antonio is running in San Antonio in our data center. Right. We want control of that thing.
Well, and if you look at how we've progressed with that, right, we used to have a rack of servers.
Yes.
And then what do we say? Well, we need to be in Europe. And so we went and we looked for a hosting provider, right? Which is kind of how we got started, right? As a company. So we're starting to look at those sorts of things. Now we're taking that to a next level, right? Which is now not only do we have these regions, but now we're actually able to very, very granularly and very, very quickly move the things where they have to be without us having to go into a colo facility, buy a bunch of hardware, assemble it, configure it, send it out there. No. We punch a button, we just deploy it.
So we've got our main data warehouse in San Antonio. We've got this other pockets of data in 4 or so locations globally. And those are running maybe in an IaaS, maybe they're running in, they're probably running IaaS, don't you think?
And it probably doesn't matter. That's the beauty of it, is it probably doesn't matter.
And we should have architected it to be flexible.
Correct.
So, and we've got that, and then we've got our code bundles, which are in those same locations, and then scattered literally everywhere around the globe across an Azure Content Delivery System would be the pictures, and in some cases the text that accompanies that.
And most of that stuff, because it is PaaS, we're not having to deal with the hardware, we're not having to deal with configuration of the VMs, we're not having RDP into it. Where it might make sense, SQL Server, high availability and DR sort of thing, always on sort of things, that might make sense. Or where we have a need to have full-blown Active Directory is another one, right?
So we haven't even got into authentication on
and so we're doing all that, but we are able to sort of pick and choose the things we want. And I would argue that in another year, 2, 5, as we start to make this journey, we're going to find more and more PaaS features supplanting the IaaS features, where we don't really need IaaS as much.
And you know what that will drive? And it'll drive what we saw, and we've been in the managed hosting business for 18 or so years here at Rackspace. And people were they were over their data centers. They were over their data centers, but their applications were not over single tenancy. So they came to Rackspace, and they came to us in droves, quite frankly. And AWS came along, Azure came along. Not a big threat to us, not a big challenge. But what happened was, when those applications, when those clouds became more than just another piece of IaaS, when they had features and capabilities that you could get there that you couldn't get anywhere else, very unique, then people were excited about moving out into those environments. And as PaaS then starts to suck the IaaS users out and into the PaaS space, they're going to do that not because people want a new shiny technology like you and I would make a move for, but because there's additional capability. That ability sometimes includes cost savings, not always. Usually it should be associated with income generation, not necessarily cost mitigation.
But either way will work for me. I'll either increase top line or I'll reduce the bottom line costs. I'll take it either way because a dollar's a dollar's a dollar. Right?
Yeah, as long as there's an extra one in my pocket.
Exactly. I really want two, but if you're happy with one, that's fine. So I can already see where our salaries are going in this new company that we're starting to build. It's interesting you bring up the issue of capability. So I think one of the traps people fall into with PaaS is they are looking for it to be essentially a serverless equivalent of something that they see with IaaS. Yeah. So here's a VM running IaaS and it's running a web application, and here's a web app, and they can see the one-to-one equivalency to that. But there are a lot of features that show up inside the cloud, especially in Azure, where there really isn't the one-to-one equivalent. One of the things I'm thinking of is Azure Automation. Automation is a platform feature. It is a feature of the Azure platform. It's being provided to you as a service. You're not having to maintain machines. You're not having to build PowerShell execution engines. You're not having to do any of that. You literally go on, write a couple of scripts, put a schedule next to it, and it just runs. And it has access to your Azure resources.
Take my mature piece of PowerShell and
extremely powerful PaaS feature that generally people don't put into the PaaS category, right? So,
and that's where you start to see significant differentiation from cloud to cloud.
Agreed.
Serious differentiation. And when you think about some of those things and the capability that Microsoft has as it relates to not just what they can do inside of their cloud, but what they can do in their on-premise or off cloud. Let's just call it off cloud.
Off cloud, sure.
So that's a new phrase you heard.
I like it.
It's off cloud.
I like it.
And when you're off cloud, Microsoft is a host. It's where the bread and butter. All the applications run there. You got SQL there. You got Windows there. You've got SharePoint. You got Exchange. You got just resource after resource that runs there. So they have cloud capabilities that glue their off cloud resources out and together. ASR, we've talked about it a couple of times. Azure Backup, another example. I can take and use Azure as a backup destination with Azure tooling to back up my on-prem resources, my off-cloud resources.
Well, and look, I don't think we're ever going to see, I shouldn't say never, but I don't think we're ever going to see a time where the innovation in cloud just stops and everybody ends up being the same. It's not going to be the combustion engine, right? Where literally everybody kind of has a combustion engine and they all pretty much
who has a better body style.
Right. I don't think we're ever going to see that in the cloud, but what we are going to see is we're going to continue to see companies that maybe, just maybe, are taking an ill-advised approach where they are saying, I'm going to only use features that are available across every public cloud because I want to avoid, yes, you heard it here, vendor lock-in.
We had that conversation last week.
We had it just last week. And the idea behind the vendor lock-in story that I think is amusing to me is talking to companies that 10 years ago said, we're going to do this thing to avoid vendor lock-in. And 10 years later, they're still on the same vendor that they were, and they've locked themselves in, not because of the features, but because of their own reliance on the vendor itself. And so that goes back to my comment about, hey, maybe the thing that you want to do is really better served as an AWS Lambda type of capability. But maybe the thing you really want to do over here is really better served with Azure's storage mechanism. And so you can sort of pick and choose. And you and I both know we're starting to see more and more companies that are multi-cloud, right?
All of them.
The ability to be able to consume those platform as a service features where it makes sense and have them interact.
That's right. So. That will be an interesting, I'm sitting here, interesting thing to see unfold. I was sitting here trying to think of analogies of, what its 1800 example would have been like. It's, hey, I don't want to get, hemmed in on a specific type of automobile. We're just going to stay on a horse because that's what everybody's got one of those.
Absolutely.
It's a horrible example, but ultimately you have companies who are making choices to not use the right technology for the job because it might make them too chummy with one individual.
Correct. But companies make those decisions all the time, right? They make their decisions to single source, their
Jacob hates
capabilities. I know he does. Jacob hates a lot of things.
He does.
Right? He hates Life cereal. Did you know that? Mikey likes it. Jacob hates it. So
he doesn't even know that commercial.
He doesn't even know who Mikey is.
He was born in 1988. He doesn't even know what that commercial.
Are you kidding me? I've got ties older than Jacob. I'm just saying. So.
All right. What's PaaS got to do with it?
PaaS has everything to do with it, my friend.
It is the future.
It is not a secondhand emotion.
I really
just say. I'm really sorry. You went there, and I had to.
Oh, you talked about this.
Tina Turner. Here we go.
I'm not going to say. I almost did. I took the breath and really got prepared.
You were almost there. So.
I was almost, and we're not going to do that.
What's PaaS got to do with it?
Oh, look, our one user went away.
Yeah. We're by ourselves in the room now.
We are.
I don't know.
It's like that all the time. I believe IaaS exists until PaaS takes everything else over. What do you think about that statement? That's what Jacob was saying the other day.
You know, I want that to be true.
Okay.
I want that to be true. But I think that I don't know how far out you're projecting, but I think that for the foreseeable future, 5 years, maybe even to 10 years, I think you're going to have the idea of a virtualized computer that you are dealing with at the OS level. I think you're still going to see that.
Do you know what I think the stepping stone to this PaaS nirvana is? DevOps.
You're probably right.
DevOps allows me to treat that VM that I'm bound to as a temporal item, something that I can destroy or create on a whim, whatever my whim might be.
So here's what I think. Now that you've brought it up, what I really believe is going to happen is not so much that IaaS is going to go away, it's that you're not going to know it's there anymore. Right?
Okay.
So you're going to be deploying, and the system, the machine, Skynet, if you will, if you're a Terminator fan, that's making the decision about where those things are going to go.
Right.
It's making the decision, perhaps even to the point, and this is way out there, perhaps even to the point of analyzing your application and saying that service really belongs better on PaaS. But that thing over there really could be an Azure function, and I'm going to strip it out and put it in an Azure function. That thing over there really belongs on a VM, and I'm going to spin a VM up to do that. And I think you're going to see, you're not going to see, right? You're not going to see that background sausage being made. Okay. You're just going to simply deploy your application.
So for those things that aren't the most scalable, in demand, we need a 5 bajillion of them, then Azure's going to make it a core feature of PaaS. That's up to us as developers then to create the intelligence in the application that it's going to put those resources where they require.
You bet. And remove the dependencies in our application so that our application is not dependent on a certain environment style or a certain operating style.
So clearly PaaS for those things that are the most commodity based across all use cases, PaaS is growing. It's not going anywhere. It is supplanting a lot of the needs for infrastructure as a service, but not ever really potentially going to get rid of it holistically, but intelligence at your application layer is really what should be taking that over. That's the kind of stuff that we really need the developers today bringing applications to Rackspace for us to support. That's what we need them to be thinking about. When they think futuristically, not how am I going to deal with the latest PaaS, but how am I going to take this application back to our high-style wingtip shoe company that we've made tens and tens of dollars on. And we need to be thinking about how that bundle of code gets dealt with. What does that code, where does it run? How does it run? What's coming in Azure from a capability perspective? How does Azure automation, could that be leveraged to spin up and spin down resources, just-in-time resources, to do the things that we think are so important?
Well, so here's just as a capper to the conversation, you sort of started off in the beginning talking about how we still have to continually talk about the benefit of the cloud and what the cloud is, et cetera. But what if the cloud gave you the ability as an organization to eliminate where someplace you spend 40% of your time, which is maintaining your hardware plant. And you could take that 40% of your time and your resources and your folks and be able to focus on innovation, right? And be able to do the innovative piece of, I'm going to redesign my application to use those features that we've talked about, right? And it's that to me is the huge advantage.
And it's advantage of us having adopted a service-oriented architecture where we've got these things ripped up into their own component parts and now can cherry pick them out and say, deal with it this way.
You might even say that they're like really, really tiny services like microservices. So you knew that. So we're going to have to do a session just on that.
It will be a rock'em sock'em robot.
Yeah, we've been talking a long time.
We have been. I think we've talked enough because that was a lot.
Yeah, that was a lot.
So I'm Jeff DeVerter, Chief Technologist here at Rackspace.
I'm Kent Kingery, Product Architect and Engineering Lead here.
And this has been What's PaaS Got to Do with It? I hope this has been helpful to you. Our contact information, I believe, is available. Feel free to reach out with any other questions. We're reachable here at Rackspace. Somebody can find us. Just give us a call.
With names like DeVerter and Kingery, you shouldn't have trouble finding us.
You'll know where to find us. We'd love to help. We'll be back in the next month or so for another one of these. We hope that you'll be here. Thanks for tuning in.
Hey, Jacob, thanks for being with us.
Jacob.